We have with us the beautiful and talented Danielle Bell from San Ramon Valley Fire. She's the head of the C8, the Contra Costa County Cities Citizen Corps CERT Committee. She leads the instructor training class, what we call T3, Train the Trainer. And she just does all sorts of good things CERT-wise. And she has a couple of beautiful kids, and one of them has challenges, has opportunities. So, and she will be discussing that with us tonight. So, Danielle, take it away.
Oh, thanks, Duncan. You're always so awesome. And hi, Julie. Great to see most of you. You know, some of you are in the black boxes, sign of the times. As I start doing this, I want you guys to know that you don't have to wait to ask a question. You can put it in the chat. You can also unmute yourself to ask a question. I've done both forums now with the Zoom where I wait to the end. And a presentation like this, I feel like can often bring up questions that maybe you don't want to write down and you kind of would like to know in the time of the presentation, which is absolutely fine with me. So please know that that's okay. I'm going to ask Duncan and Julie to kind of look out for the chat room for me, because sometimes I can mishap that as I'm into the presentation. So happy to be here. Great to see you guys. Hope everyone's doing well through months and months and months and months of being home. I'm going to share my screen.
While you're doing that, Danielle, I would ask that everyone mute themselves unless they are actively asking a question, just so we don't have background noises popping in and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this is recognizing and responding to autism. As CERT, you are first responders. And the other presentation I created, it has CERT on there. I used this one because I ended up having to use my kiddo's laptop today. We were having internet issues, so we made it all work. So today I'm really to inform you, educate you, but inspire you in some way to understand autism maybe better than you might, or maybe this is your first time getting exposed to what autism is. And I used to do the presentation where it kind of involved other access and functional needs. But when it came down to how we respond as first responders, if you know about autism, it almost preps you for anything that you might encounter, which is kind of the goal for us, especially in CERT, that we kind of have this broad range and also know what we can do to help people who behave differently than we do, perhaps. And I'll go more into that. So that's my little one when he was just 3 or 4 years old. We were in a range of studies through the Mind Institute in Sacramento, which we still participate in. And actually both of my kids were diagnosed with autism, my son severely and my daughter mildly with pervasive developmental disorder, which is still autism. And I'll talk a little more about that. But the reason I love to say both is that recovery can happen for some kids and adults. I will say it's not widely pushed that that happens. And it's, I hope one day that that changes. There's so much fear about getting the diagnosis. And I do, on my personal level of belief, I do think kids, my daughter Layla kind of chose to be here in a different way. And I think when we can come to some resolution in our hearts that maybe we're not all supposed to show up in the world the same way, then having my son still be on the spectrum is absolutely not a bad thing, but an opportunity, as Duncan said earlier, but also a joy in a different way. So he didn't learn to talk till he was 7. So learning to communicate with him and show him affection and love really broadened who I was and how I showed up in the world. and what was important to me. So it's been a wild adventure, super hard in some days, in some ways, and super rewarding in others that I don't think people who don't have someone on the spectrum would experience. So about 4 years ago, I went back and got my master's in really counseling, but also this idea of neuroplasticity. And that's really the edge that our neurons actually can develop and grow, and that our brains are constantly changing, and in the right environment and with the right set of things that each person needs, you can actually expand the growth of the brain and what you're learning. And I really have found that for both of my kids, myself, in trainings, in doing mindfulness, and especially for showing up with somebody who doesn't know how to connect with you. So we went through a program. Do I have the slide? No, I got to go back. We went through a program that is based out of the Autism Treatment Center of America, which is back in Massachusetts. And in this, apologies, I usually have a slide. We have a room that was just designed for both of our kids that had nothing in it. And on the top level, it had a shelf, which you would have to reach up to get anything that could be requested. So the goal was to enter our children's worlds, do what they were doing to create some type of connection, then to get something. So we did all the other things. I mean, with Jake, I think we did 20 different protocols at one time, just to try whatever we could to help him. And it became, over the years, more about creating connection and relationship than it did to make him better or get him off the spectrum. And that's where my love for wanting to do this work and do train first responders how to help people on the spectrum, because by the time Jake was 1, I had already done CPR on him to try to bring him back from having a seizure and just not being able to breathe. So that happened twice with us. By the age of 2 to 3, he would find ways to get on stuff and then just jump off. Like he had climbed up a ladder once, jumped off, and we didn't know what was wrong or if anything was wrong with him because of the fact that he didn't have, and I'll talk about this during that presentation, a really high pain tolerance. So his body didn't affect in the ways that maybe somebody else like you or I would feel something like that and falling off a ladder. And we'll kind of talk about what that looks like for us as CERT members when we're treating people who could be on the spectrum. So why focus on autism? It's 1 in 42 boys, 1 in 68 kids, and that continues to go up. And I think what I would love for everyone to get from this slide is not the fact that it's super high or why it's super high. Is it environmental? Is it better testing? We could have that question. That's a 30-minute question by itself. But it is a good focus for us to know that it's prevalent and that it's something we need to address and look at, because no matter what, especially in a disaster, and for most of us in everyday life, we're going to encounter people on the spectrum. And I hope that even after this presentation, that you will too, kind of like when you buy a car and then you see that car everywhere, that having some exposure of behaviors and who maybe these people are that show up with living with autism in this world, that you'll be more keen to notice and support them and their parents, which is huge. This is one of Jake's birthday parties. And the one thing I will say is that autism affects everybody differently. So you might know one child and then 10 others don't show up at all the same way. There's some characteristics, but the spectrum is really global, from mild to severe and through all the behaviors that they have. Hoping the video will play just to change it up too from me.
What is autism? Autism spectrum disorders are increasing at an alarming rate across the country and around the world.
Autism is described as a neurodevelopmental disability. So that means it's neuro, involves the brain, And developmental means that it starts very early in life when the brain is still forming, still plastic, still changeable.
Uh-oh. Sorry.
What is autism? Autism spectrum disorders are increasing at an alarming rate across the country and around the world.
Autism is described as a neurodevelopmental disability. So that means it's neuro, involves the brain, and developmental means that it starts very early in life when the brain is still forming, still plastic, still changeable. And it involves differences and usually difficulties in three areas: social interaction, communication, and then the presence of narrow, repetitive behaviors, difficulty with change.
Dr. Gary Mesabov is the director of Division Teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Teach is known globally for its pioneering approaches to service, treatment, training, research, and the education of individuals with autism.
The distribution usually is found more frequently in males than females, usually a 4-to-1 ratio. But there's a really wide range in terms of intellectual ability. We have people with autism with IQs below 25. We have people with IQs above 150. Also, there's emotional lability that very often goes with autism. So their emotions can change very quickly. They can become upset, scared, anxious very, very quickly. Or 1 minute be very anxious and then calm down quickly, or vice versa. There are other things, other associated behaviors that you see very frequently.
Terms such as low functioning will describe persons who will have a caregiver with them at all times and persons who may be nonverbal. They may use alternative communication, such as sign language, picture board, or computers that speak for them.
I need help.
High-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome are terms that describe persons who will be verbal and who will live semi or fully independent lives.
Just because a person has autism doesn't mean that they're bad. It's just that they're not very, they don't communicate as well as a normal person.
Be patient and give the person a few extra seconds to process the information and say what they have to say clearly.
Everybody's different, and don't expect the same thing with one person as you might with the other. One of my best advice is try to get on the same level they are. Try to understand where they're coming from, even though they may be able to understand where you're coming from. Try to understand where they're coming from.
They need to know about autism. They need to know about how it feels to have autism. Need to learn it.
There are just so many things in life they can misunderstand in, just they're trying hard, they're doing their best. The world is just complicated. And that also
Danielle, can you put your volume back on because we cannot hear the video anymore?
first in the definition. So, and part of a social impairment is a lot of things you do look impolite and are not necessarily from the same motivation and the same understanding as a typical person. So, you're approaching a person with autism and they run away doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty. It could mean you're flashing light and the noisy mall that you found themselves in has now become very confusing or distressing, or answering some of these very concrete answers doesn't mean he's avoiding your question. It means that he's answering your question as he understands it. But I think if you spend a little time around people with autism and around somebody who understands autism, I think you can get a basic handle on some of these patterns.
Sorry about the couple of glitches there. Getting the zoom down. So as he talked about, this is really a social impact. There are a lot of science to say we have a neurogut issue, but when it comes out, we have behaviors and we have people who think and behave differently. So it's one of those things I would really encourage you that if you get to meet someone who has autism or you have somebody with autism in your family, is to take the time to be with them and join their world. So in that video, you had I think 3 out of the 5 say, learn us, be with us. And that can really look like if you're sitting down, like say you're in the grass and you're sitting with somebody on the spectrum and they're like this. Either get a rubber band or get something that you might have with you and just start looking at it. And you might occasionally even get a glance like, wow, this person like wants to know what I'm doing. And you might not. But it's taking the time, I call it kind of a meditative state, where you really enter, like maybe feeling the rubber band and noticing the rubber band in a different way. And someone who on your CERT team is like really patient, really kind, isn't in a hurry. You've seen kind of under situations that they're a little bit more chill. Might be a great person to have for someone who is on the spectrum. It's somebody who can just be with somebody and not have expectation that they should be any other way than what they are. And in our society, that's just, we live with expectation. We think people should act a certain way and be a certain way. And it's no fault to our own. It's just how we're all brought up. So I love this thing that it's not a disability, it's an ability. It's just a different ability than we have. My son has just different foresight than I would ever have. And although his communication is different, I'm always in awe of how he interprets things and sees things and can communicate in a place of, I don't like that, I don't want this, where I feel like sometimes we question ourselves a lot to even delineate what we need in the moment. So we'll see it differently. I'll talk more about the communication and social interaction. Now in the video, he talks about Asperger's syndrome. They've actually just gotten rid of these delineations in autism spectrum disorder. For the diagnosing part, they just put it under 1. I think that doesn't really serve, but it is what it is. I still tend to use, like if I'm working with someone's child, I will ask if they were diagnosed. Usually in new diagnosis, they don't get this, but most people I work with have had the diagnosis a year, 2 more. Asperger's is usually socially they're awkward, but they're really, really smart. They really get certain things, but they'll have an ultra focus. Like I'm working with a child right now that loves iPhones. So he knows, I didn't even know they had so many iPhones. He knows there's an iPhone 5, iPhone 6, 6S, a 7, there's an 8. He knows there's not a 9 or a 10, but he knows the intricate details of every component of the iPhone. So if you were buying a phone, I would connect you with him because that is his ism, as we call it, a STEM. So Asperger's tend to really focus on certain things like that. Yes, everybody in the spectrum does, but Asperger's syndrome, they tend to be higher IQ and can generally interact and have some social cues and kind of know how to have conversation. It's just awkward. For somebody that's on the spectrum might not even know to look you in the eyes or know to have any conversation with you. Childhood disintegrative disorder is actually rare. We have more out here in the Bay Area because of the services we offer, but it's when a child is typically developing and they actually don't lose their skills to their 4 or 5 and they become autistic. This is 2% of the population, so it's very small in the autism world. And we know one child who has had childhood disintegrative disorder and really didn't notice anything until, I'd say within a couple of weeks, had full-on autism. PDD NOS is what I talked about earlier, that Layla was diagnosed with in autism, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And to be not PC, that's basically autism without you're not going to get services because it's mild enough, and there's so many cases they had to delineate who would get services from the various programs. So, and now you just have kind of the spectrum. Any questions yet so far? I think Duncan had said, oops, there might be one, but I don't see my chat room. So Duncan, I don't know if you wanna, maybe not.
I can go on. Somebody asked, is high pain tolerance a common characteristic for all people on the spectrum?
Awesome, thanks, Julie. It's about half of them. And I'm gonna talk more about the sensory issues that they have. I would say the 100 kids I've worked with, I would say probably 30% of them have this really high pain tolerance. So we do see it. And then you'll have really low pain tolerance too. So I'm going to get to that. There's some slides about that. If it's not answered, definitely ask that again.
Christina is nonverbal.
No, we're not going to do any work.
She uses pictures to communicate her basic needs.
Okay, you want? Let's go.
Today, she wants to go to the store. Off she goes with Mom. At the store, Christina has trouble selecting what she wants.
Come on, don't open them until I pay for them.
She makes her choice
Thank you.
and pays the cashier.
Your receipt? All right, get your bag, book.
Christina's mom worries about her future. What will people think? Is she a shoplifter? Is she high on drugs? Will they understand? Or will they call the police? Jonathan is 15. He likes to read, ride his bike, and play basketball.
I slammed up. I can't get it.
Observe this. Jonathan becomes upset when he can't make a left-handed dunk.
I can't get it. Hey. Okay. Oh.
Dunk accomplished, Jonathan immediately calmed down.
In school, Jonathan does not have a behavior file at all. He has never been in any trouble whatsoever in school. It's at home where he stays in trouble. He stays in trouble at home. He is at times very aggressive. He is extremely strong, which I presume all children with autism are probably as strong if they are able to, if they are at that level, okay? He may get hurt because they may assume that he's on some type of drugs, and he will flip people around because he is that strong, where you could grab him and next thing you know, you may be on the ground and they may pull their weapons. But I also want him to know that police officers can be your friend. That's where you need to go. If something happens, you need to find a police officer in a uniform and run to them.
Sorry, I don't know why the end of the videos do that. Wakes you up if you weren't awake already. So this really is showing that it is so hard for them. We went to yesterday to play in the pool, and we were playing this game with my son and my daughter and a friend where you call out colors and you jump in the pool, and my son couldn't quite put it together, and all of a sudden just started crying, got out of the pool, and just was so beside himself. And these are the times, like, he's gotten so much better and he's so integrated now that I'm always like, wow, what's the matter? And I forget, right, that he still lives with this very rigid kind of way that it needs to be. And he was so upset that how he calculated the game in his brain actually isn't fair, right? And it was so great because my daughter just knows how to work with him so well now. And she was like, hey, I don't really like that game either. Let's try something else. And a year ago, he would have never tried something else. We would have been done. everything would have been over. And he was like, okay, well, what is it? You know, like right away, but everyone kind of knows how to work with him. So the rigidity of how something should go, just like in this video with the basketball, it might not have looked like, oh, I needed to get it, but it's, I need to get this or I can't do anything else. And when I do get it, I'm all done. So that's that, my way or the highway, which is, you know, common for toddlers, but this is what happens for people on the spectrum, usually for their span, but depending on how they integrate and they do and grow. So common characteristics, 50% are nonverbal, and you saw on that picture deck that there's PEC systems. So they're picture systems where they basically show what you want. Do you want a drink? Do you want food? Are you hurt? And it's a picture that they can actually point to. They lack eye-to-eye contact. This is across the board. I have seen and worked with people that have Asperger's that have better eye contact, but it's somewhat fleeting. Even if it's here, it's then gone. It's that check-in and then it's gone. But even my son now, like there are some people I'm like, well, why don't you try with Auntie Heather just to look at her when she comes over? You know, because we're in this space now where I think it doesn't bring as much anxiety for him. And we have to be careful as CERT people, especially in a disaster, that we don't require them to look at us, that they can actually hear us, know what they need to respond without making any eye contact. Because basically what it is it brings anxiety and it brings discomfort for them to a point where whatever behavior they might be exhibiting will worsen, and they will maybe run away or try to hit you or take care of themselves. So we don't want to push them to have eye contact with us. You will find that people who have kids on the spectrum at home are working on eye contact and looking at people, but that's a different frame from what we need to engage with. So may invade your space. So I have found it's either this or that. They either are very close to you and will get in your face, or they will keep their distance and you'll know right away, but to kind of honor what that is for them. So if you have somebody that maybe you're triaging and you know that there's somebody that really gets into the space of other people, you know, electing a couple people who might be more comfortable with that. I know on one of my first calls after I had done this training 6-7 years ago, the first call I went on, the kiddo, he was in high school, literally took my badge, put it in his mouth, and like was in front of my face. And I was like, oh, you know, and I was just like, I just need to breathe. I need to think what I need to do. But I knew if I pushed him out of this space and he had a contusion to the head, he was bleeding, that I knew if I had to push him out of the space, it would have created a new problem. So it was trying to get comfortable with someone an inch away from my face. So you'll find either way that they will want to avoid it, or they might be interested in stuff that you have on. Parents are usually seeking treatment around 2 to 5 years of age. I have found that to be even later. There's some resistance when you have somebody on the spectrum not wanting to be different, not wanting to go down that road. There's a multiple different attitudes about impact, about not accepting what's going on. So we have to be gentle with that, especially around if we think somebody's on the spectrum and their parents are like, no, they're not. And you would be surprised even on calls that can happen. So just honoring that space for them, sorry. And just treating it with the knowledge that you're learning now. And you don't need to say, yes, they are. It's like not the place for the conversation. So they have a wide range of abilities, even though they're somewhere on the spectrum. So, and I'll talk about towards the end, like trying to find what works for them and to cue in to get into their world. We've talked about that. Not all of them have the same symptoms and affects them from different degrees. This is Jake when he was little, and he would literally line anything we gave him. So if we went somewhere, there was like little teeny Beanie Babies behind this picture, which he had just got done. And my dad, when he was this age, got those tennis balls from Costco, like 3 sets of 100, whatever packaging they were in. And he would make the coolest designs. I haven't found that picture around the house, because that's literally what he would do. We call this isming or stemming. This is a way that people on the spectrum calm themselves. And if you take away a stem, they will find another stem and generally feel more stressed in trying to find another way to take care of themselves. Finger play is a very, very common one. So you might see someone with their kids shopping, and if you see this, usually on the autism spectrum or have Tourette's or something of like, and this is a way to calm themselves while they're shopping. It kind of goes hand in hand with, I don't know if any of you were ever hair twirlers or your nail biters. We don't really understand why we do it, but we know it calms the nervous system. Jake was also a spinner. So he spent 12 to 14 hours a day spinning around the house, which was actually very nauseating at first because I paid direct attention to it, where that was just really for his vestibular, what we'll talk about in a little while, way he calmed his body and his sensory needs. And once I allowed that behavior to happen, the interaction when he wasn't spinning was so much better. But when we didn't know, we did try to stop the spinning. And every time we're met with a lot of behaviors and screaming and yelling and discomfort. So just remember, this is a way that they organize their bodies and their brains. And you'll see all the different ones here. Lining, stacking objects is very common across the board. The wiggling fingers, flapping hands, dropping things to hear their sound. Anything that's repetitive that you see, it's a pretty good chance that they're impacted somewhere on the spectrum. There's a lot of rocking. I would say that's a big one. And then chewing and licking, which is, and I will talk about, we are creating bags to go on all our ambulances, and Duncan, I'll give you all that stuff to give to Martyr and to Fire. But they're basically things that they can chew and eat on. And generally parents, I have found, don't like their kids using that kind of stuff. I got over it real quick, and I think it's different for every parent. And so having that though in a disaster is huge, because it's a way that they calm their system down by chewing and by sucking on things. So these are all, again, called stimming isms. Now there's something called perseveration. So when I talked about Asperger's and people on the spectrum, when they perseverate about a certain topic, and that's the topic they want to talk about. So any kid that I work with or adults on the spectrum, if they come in talking about something, or I want to tell you all about my USB, what my USB does, how many gigs it is. I'm like, tell me. I want to know everything about your USB. There's no way I'm going to talk about something else besides what they need to talk about. So remembering that in a high stress situation, whatever they're perseverating about, it might be, I was just reading. We don't go now to now there's a disaster. We say, you were just reading, until they can then move the conversation off of that, because they will, but we have a tendency of not entering their world and wanting to push our agenda to what we want them to see. And even in this kind of crisis mode, we still need to take that 15 seconds to 30 seconds to really enter their world. Perseveration, my first real memory of like, wow, this is amazing, was I took Jake to go see Rio. It was that little bird movie. And when we came out, we got in the car, I thought I heard birds. And I was like, there's no birds, there's no trees around here. It's so weird. And then Jake proceeded reciting the whole movie. I was like, wow, I can't remember one line from the movie, but here's my kid saying the whole movie. But then I realized when I interrupted him, he started all over. That's perseveration. So when I got home, I'm like, nobody say anything. Just let him finish the movie, because I didn't want it to start all over. And I do think it took like 24 hours. He went to bed in a certain place, woke up, still saying it. So that's kind of that same routine. Having a schedule, a lot of kids will be on schedules that are more severely, moderately to severely impacted. And that was that low functioning you heard earlier. So those are kind of the different terms: low functioning, high functioning, mildly impacted, severely impacted. Schedules really help them know what's coming next to put some organization. So if we're in a disaster mode, or we're doing a training and somebody shows up on the spectrum and they use schedules, we want to keep with that schedule. I heard you you brushed your teeth, you got in the car, and you're here. Now we do the drill, or we do this, and you go to the car and you go home. So they might want to have that conversation. So just know if they're scheduling something and they need to, and maybe you get somebody who can actually participate in a drill and they're wanting you to map out an ICS form, but they want to hear it how it needs to be. And that might take an extra 2 minutes for them to read every single box to you, but they're going to get that box better than anybody else that you probably have there. But they need to be able to say to you, and you to be able to reiterate back what they've told you. So I love this one. Johnny's awesome, but also because of the literal interpretation.
How old are you now, Jonathan?
15.
How old?
15.
15.
15.
Okay, and when did you turn 15?
On my birthday.
Of course, right? On your birthday. But I think one of the things, even still to this day, if I say something like, "You rock," Jake will be like, "I am not a rock. I am not gray. I am not hard." I'm like, "Oh, yeah." Didn't mean it like that. So there's the literal interpretation. We have a lot of those euphemisms in our language. So remembering, especially in a disaster situation, to be clear about what you want to say. I often find myself in conversation in our family having to describe what I'm trying to say using correct language and not that language that, for all of us is easy to understand. So echolalia is saying back the words. So part of Jake's reciting of the movie is echolalia. I would say most come into language using echolalia. So they might say, "How are you?" You could say, "How are you?" And they'd say, "How are you? What are you doing here? What are you doing here? Are you okay? Are you okay?" So this becomes a real big issue when I do trainings for law officers, because if they're going to question someone, it does look really disrespectful if a teenager is then reciting back what they're saying, but it's a really big indicator that they might be on the spectrum too. So echolalia is really how they kind of come into language. 40% have seizures. That's a little higher now. Not exactly sure what the raise is, but just knowing, and especially in a disaster situation, if they have a history of seizures, it may just be something you're writing out with them, that it doesn't, and especially in a disaster, that need treatment. So you're really just staying with the person, talking to the person, and being with the person. So common symptoms. So most people on the spectrum have a lot of stuff going on. I know for Jake, he had GI tract issues, he had the poor immune function, he had urination, he had poor appetite, sleeping disturbances, chemical sensitivities. He didn't have anxiety, sensitivity to touch and sound, easily frustrated, frequent emotional meltdowns, so all that too. So I would say most do, so know that they have a lot going on, and so do their parents. And then a lot of people, especially in the Bay Area, are doing a lot of different treatments. This could be supportive to you in a disaster situation. If they're having really bad behaviors, you could actually ask, is there any treatment that you guys are doing right now? Obviously, we are not going to be treating them, but it gives us a better indication too of what could be going on for them. So one of the popular ones out here is chelation, which is down below here, because it's so cheap and it's so easy to literally, I mean, any of us could do it, stick your feet into a tub or a small thing, and you put in mud, which secretes and takes out metals, especially mercury, lead, and drops the metals from the body. So the first time we did this for Jake, he had no language and then talked in sentences. Motivating? Very. It also had huge consequences for him. He became very aggressive. He started hitting, he started biting. So it was like this weighing out balance of what do we want to do? Do we want to continue doing that? We did it probably 2 more times and then we never did it again. Because it just had too many side effects. So kind of understanding a little bit that people on the spectrum might have other things going on. So to be able to ask those questions can just give us a better idea. Possibly if they're having these big behavioral things and someone says, oh my gosh, we just got done doing this gut treatment and I don't know, they might need more time alone, separation, and something that will get better with a little bit of time, especially if we're looking at a day, 24 hours, 48 hours of not being in our normal circumstances. So this is Evan, and Evan and Jake went to the same program. And this will just give you an idea. We both entered the program at the Autism Treatment Center at the same time because both Evan and Jake were very aggressive, had what we call, why am I losing the word? Self-inflicting pain because of the way, and we'll talk about that next, the sensory issues they had were. And notice here how he comforts himself.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Evan. Bye-bye. First kiss with brother, commentate.
Oh. Where's the fan? Where's the fan? Fan. No, fan. Point to the fan. Point to the fan. 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 Point to the fan. Where? What do you want to do? Run? Run.
So I have to obviously leave you with something nice after the video because it can be hard to watch. We used to help each other with our kids because it was, you can imagine when this began, their behaviors, it was hard to be with, hard to know what to do, at a loss. And I feel for parents that are going through that, and I always will offer help and support. Definitely always put that out there. And it is also a learning curve to know we need to help in not stopping all those behaviors, but making them more comfortable. So, and I will talk about a little bit why that's happening. But like putting a pillow in front of Evan's face, we obviously didn't learn these things till we went back east and did a different program. But I've been to a school site where I've had someone headbanging on like a concrete wall, and putting a pillow and slowly moving that person to the ground so they can continue doing what they're doing. Because oftentimes when they're in that state, to pull them from that will only get worse. And especially as kids get older and they get bigger, they become more violent to deal with. So kind of meeting them, that's where that meeting them where they're at and making it as safe as possible. So what is going on for them? So we're familiar with our 5, the sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, but there's 2 other sensory modalities, and that's our vestibular and our proprioception. Our vestibular is really our movement, our balance in time and space. It allows us to kind of regulate ourselves and informs our motion. So it's one of those things when you have a friend who always walks into the side of you, you're like, why are you walking into me? We're walking straight. That could be some vestibular stuff going on, the inner senses in the ear. And then proprioceptive is your time and space, like your body, and knowing it's safe and sound. And Jake used to walk along things to feel the sensory sensation. I remember taking him to our fire department boardroom, and it's like a circular thing where everybody sits, and he had to walk all the way around it. And that was part of him knowing his body was there and feeling a sense of himself. And one area that this can be disturbed is like if you drink too much and you wake up and you're kind of like, oh, that yucky feeling. Not that I've ever had that. That's part of that inner senses that do get messed up. And for a lot of people on the spectrum, that's what they're dealing with. So even more, we have 12 cranial nerves. The 3rd cranial nerve, our vestibular, our trigeminal nerve, really affects our vestibular and our proprioception. So this is also causes overload. And it's often the thing that for when you have dental work done and you need numbing agent to help you get through that, we have found through autism that this trigeminal nerve can be impacted. So for kids who have self-injurious behaviors and tend to hit themselves, this nerve could be at play for some of them. So sensory overload issues, generally, the kid is going to be pretty impacted, or adult pretty highly on that, or not. So this is Jake when we went to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, because I just wanted to get out, and I took my daughter and my son by myself. Lessons learned. As soon as we walked in, opened the door to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, just think to yourself for a moment what that entails. It's huge. It echoes. It smells like fish, and they have sensory issues around smell, taste, hearing, and it's usually pretty crowded, so you have a ton of people. So as soon as I opened the door, he turned around and ran down the middle of Cannery Row, the street, just ran away. No perception of like that he could get hit by a car, that it would cause danger, that cars would try to avoid him. So that not only for him was I like, oh, because of his pain tolerance, but he has absolutely no awareness of safety issues. So this is where he finally stopped, and it's kind of like all the way down the street where you go to, you can see the ocean, and I think Bubba Gumps is down there. It's been a while since I've been. And he plopped down, he took his little boat and he ran it in front of his face for a half hour. And I'll tell you, there's like this little thing right here, this bubble gum. And people were like, there's bubble gum on the floor. I'm like, I don't care. He's fine. Just keep on walking, right? Still trying to calm myself. And people that day were amazing. Like there was somebody who crashed into something and he was like, don't worry about it. Everything's okay. That's why I have insurance. Like it was a beautiful moment of humanity for me. And also a very big moment for me of not caring what anybody thought. Because I had my daughter with me. He needed to calm down. I needed to calm down. The pizza place that was there brought me a pizza and wine because I went to the beach and waited for my dad to come. Everybody like came together. It was amazing. And he got up from this moment and he was like, fish, more fish. And I was like, oh, you're so cute. No more fish. It didn't work out. So we spent like 7 hours because, I had to process all the things that could have happened. So that is pretty general for somebody on the spectrum, not, especially the younger ones, I'd say below 10, don't really get with that safety. We did so much training around cars, people, horses, dogs, to really understand that there is a consequence. So the visual and auditory plethora of things going on can really shut them down to understanding anything that's at play. So they often can't tolerate light touch. They either want touch or they don't want any touch at all. These bags I got, they're sensory bags. My kids would get on them and play in them and stay in them for hours, sleep in them. It was something I wanted to put on the ambulances, but it's a little tricky to get kids in that. It would be nice. And they crave deep pressure. My son slept under his mattress, which I have to tell you at like 4 and 5, I was like, oh, he's going to crush his organs. It's not going to be okay. But he would go from, he didn't sleep through the night till he was 4. And I think it was like 5 or 6 hours. Once we realized the bed on top of him, he was like, oh. And I was like, oh, okay, you can sleep with the bed on top of you. That's fine. But think about how heavy a mattress is. So that deep kind of pressure. And I noticed that kids that I work with that like touch, they like really a lot of touch, a lot of pressure. But if you were to go like that, it's like too much. Very hypersensitive. I haven't worked with many kids that don't have some sensitivity to hearing. So they'll often cover their ears to help that vestibular system calm down. But it could be to sirens, to vacuums. It's a big thing in school, not that we have to deal with it now, of the fire bells, the drills that we have. And sometimes in certain classrooms, you can have it ring differently, but it's become so much of an issue in school systems because of that. One of the things in the bag that I'm creating for the ambulances is those noise canceling headphones, because they really do help, and generally they'll wear them because they know they help. So we talked about aversion to eye contact, so not asking for eye contact. But in addition, fluorescent lighting is really hard for people on the spectrum. So, and it is not just the light itself, it is that there's a lot of buzzing. If you were to walk into a store and just really take in the sensory overload that happens. For a while, we did this whole thing with Jake where we'd walk into a store just to see what happened. He'd be like, yep. And he'd like name off the light bulbs that were there and the frequency, and nope, can't go in there. Wow, okay, awesome, no problem. When we walked into Costco for a while, he had to open every refrigerator door and close it for us to shop. You can imagine what people are like, what are they doing? I feel like it became more of a norm out here for us, and people were just like, oh, it's them. But it helped him for whatever reason to the sensitivity that he had going on. And we'd usually always have his headphones on, and he would know not to look up because of the lighting, but it's also very, how they're built is disturbing to the vision for them. So it could be mirrors, it could be windows, but there could be a lot of things at play. I mean, you talk about just the hearing and the vision alone, let alone everything already going on in their bodies. It's amazing that they can go out. So these are the PEC systems. They help with the language barrier. I would say probably 20 to 30% no sign language, but for us to learn sign language on the other end would be a little bit challenging. So the PEC system is kind of like a intersectionality of both worlds. And then we talked about not using metaphors. So the universal pain assessment tool, Jake still has a really high tolerance for pain. So like when he gets really hurt, I'm still like, are you sure? Like, can I feel your bones? We don't use the universal pain assessment in first responding for people on the spectrum because they don't know. They can actually have hypotolerance too, where everything feels painful. So if you were to prick them, or the noise could feel almost overwhelming. So that's why always getting them to a place where they can decompress and it's not noisy and there's not a ton of stuff going on around them will help you figure out what they need next, or let them communicate with you in some way. So they lack the theory of mind, and that is stepping into somebody's shoes to understand what's going on. So Jake, the third time he lost his language, when he came to, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after we left the pumpkin patch, it was the day after he didn't talk anymore. He told us 3 weeks later, he was like, Mom, my mind was like erupting, like it was a volcano, it was exploding, and I just had to give it time to relax. That was like the first theory of mind, because he could understand what was going on for him and then communicate it, which we can do, right? If we have something that happens or someone makes us mad, we know what happened, we say what happened, and then we can process however we need to. But that's really tricky for somebody on the spectrum. So I really saw that in play. I added that in because it's huge. When Jake started kind of getting that, was huge. So proper social interaction, we still see this a lot. He gets along with younger kids much better. He's going to be 16 this year, but love him hanging out with younger children. I think too, because they're not so judgmental, but his social interaction is young. So he's kind of learning in that peer related, even though he'll be a sophomore in high school. And they can lack social awareness. So this is a good example that happened last week. Jake went out with his first time, and there was a younger friend of my daughter's best friend, and he's 9. And Jake is no longer violent. He's not self-injurious. He actually communicates super well. And he's just a kind soul. So this was like, I go to pick him up, and he gets in the car. It's visually super frustrated. The kid gets in the back and the girl sit in the middle. I'm like, how was it? And Jake says, it was terrible. And I have for you to know that you're annoying. He's talking to this little boy. You're just an annoying little boy. And it was really hard to be around you. I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay, so Jake, that's what I would call really rude. Even if he's annoying, you could tell me and Layla when he's gone, and his sister's like, he is annoying, trying to stick up for Jake. But then Jake proceeded with, he didn't answer my questions the way he should have, and I felt like punching him. And I was like, oh, wow, this is that curve of social awareness. And my immediate reaction, which isn't usually, but I haven't heard anything like this from Jake in, I don't know, 8-9 years, was like, you will never hurt somebody because they don't agree with you. I'm like, that is not okay. And then I was like, I'm sorry I overreacted like that, but what was going on for you? But for him to describe, it was like this series of events that this little boy couldn't answer, and Jake wanted to buy him a toy, and he didn't know what toy. It was like super frustrating for Jake. And I was like, wow, those are like little problems. If he was hurting you, or he hit you, or something, and I tried to name like what would be a social awareness issue that maybe something like that would happen, and Jake was like, oh, that makes so much sense, Mom. And I'm like, so I know we've had these conversations before, did just not register for you before? And he was like, I've never been put in this situation. I'm like, wow, that's really articulate, but oh my gosh, so much to learn about situations. So that social awareness, super impacted. So why is it critical to recognize autism? For all the obvious reasons, but to provide some predictability for them, which they don't have. And for us, it's really to think outside the box. It might not be the normal thing that we're used to doing. So it kind of sets us up in a way where if we need to make a space for two people who are doing kind of the same behaviors that are on the spectrum, can we create a space for them, a safe space? Can we get a mom the help she needs in a disaster or some time away from her son who may be having a really hard time, but get enough information from her to create this scenario? So it's really thinking outside the box of things that we might usually do, because we might usually depend upon the mom to tell us what to do, but she might be so tapped out from the whole thing and that they're safe and the child's losing it, she's losing it, that we may have to intervene to think about something. So creating a network of people who might be better to do that than others. And it's to understand this growing population of people, for sure. So most common calls, drowning is the #1 cause of death. The calls that I've helped on with the county, my first biggest thing is to always see where there's a body of water, because they tend to navigate towards that because it fulfills all sensory inclinations. It's the touch, it's the smell, it's everything. It's that impact of having water, even though most of them don't know how to swim, right? Because you would have to learn to take instruction to swim and keep it as a skill. So as I talked about with Jake, elopement, just running off, those are the two most common calls I see a lot, like the water and the elopement. Suspicious person, I see more and more, especially people of color that are on the spectrum. I see this even worse, because if they're in a store and they're making those noises or they're flickering things and they touch something and then they maybe walk it over and then they drop it somewhere else, they're now a suspicious person in the store. Self-injurious and aggressive behaviors, which we talked about, and really caregivers not knowing what to do. So there's a call that we use in the police and fire department called a 5150. And it's basically a call for someone who is not doing well in a mental capacity and needs to be restrained and taken to county. This is an area where I've tried to really work and help police officers and firefighters know there's additional steps that we need to take before we send someone off on a 5150. And I would say half of those calls are parents not knowing what to do anymore. You can imagine if Jake or Evan, like the video I showed you, were older, 15, having self-injurious behaviors, and you're a parent of them. That's really hard. So calling someone to help come get your child seems like a quick fix, but the problem is once they get to county, they stay there for 24, 48, 72 hours is the max. They're also dysregulated now. So to come back home can be even harder. And so taking the time to educate people, and sometimes it's just having a break and seeing a real person, having a conversation. I remember once Jake had taken all the lead off the tips of pencils and crayons and filled his eye sockets with them for no particular reason, obviously. And I was beside myself because at that point I knew I couldn't take him to the ER anymore because it was just so traumatic, between the lights, the smells, the different chaotic things going on with emergency vehicles coming, people walking around, people coming in or probing you, all of it. Like it was like, okay, I'm not going back unless I direly have to. So I called our local crew and they came over and I was like, okay, let's sit down and let's strategize. And he was still twirling at that time. And we did eye flushes. We twirl him, drop him back, flush his eyes, bring him back up, take him to the next person, twirl him, squeeze his eye, squeeze the bottle, flush his eyes. And it was enough to get most of the stuff out of his eyes, and eyes crazily heal. And I hate knowing that, but I do know that. And for me, it was just having the support system to sit down in this crazy event and not know what I'm doing and just come up with a plan together. fulfilled me, I can't tell you, for weeks, just that gratitude that I had. So knowing that caregivers kind of just need that ear sometimes, or something out of the box, especially in a disaster. Time, I think I'm going to skip this one. So as we said, it fulfills all 5 senses. Some ways to maximize risk. So this was, I forgot it, in the 80s with Bruce Willis, but it's a great caption.
How you doing, champ? You okay in there? Come on. You can come on out now. Nobody's gonna hurt you. I'm not gonna hurt you. Okay? Come on. Come on. Call Concordia. An ambulance over here. Have some badges waiting for us when we get there. For what? I want this kid protected.
How am I going to justify the overtime?
Since when you worry about overtime, Jack? The coroner says murder-suicide. They can go. Anybody asks about the overtime, put it on Lomax's gold card.
So that part right there, which we need to go back to, it really shows how, even though it was like this physical experience right at the beginning, that he self-regulated to find a stimming thing, right, that calmed his body down. So kind of remembering that you might need to move somebody because of a situation, but knowing that generally, if you know what they need, they have a perseveration that you're aware of, or allowing them to find something and allowing them to do it can be the key. No, see, still running this. Let's see if I can go right where it's at.
Come on, unstrap. Safety. All right, Simon, we're going to distract you. Take it easy. Simon, just calm down, all right? I'm going to turn that off. Turn that off! Turn the siren off! Simon, oh, hey. Now look, who is this? Is that your mommy right there? Is that your mommy? Right there? Yes, that's right, your mommy. That's her. Is that your daddy? Daddy. Right. Don't touch it, may be hot. Very good advice. Is that your teacher, Dr. London? She's your friend, right? Well, my name is Art. I'm your friend too.
So in that particular moment where he was reading his thing, that's his schedule and that's his learning, right? Who's mom, who's dad, who's your friend? And when he said, I'm your friend, that's out of his routine. So what could you do? Just kind of think. Of course, I'm going to tell you the answer. But you would start at the first cue card, right? Instead of kind of giving up and throwing it to the side, you can readjust and restart that ism for him, right? So repeating that again and again might be all he needs, but he doesn't want it added that you're his friend. And I love this clip, and I haven't really found anything more up to date that really kind of shows the perseveration, the noise. Also, I teach our firefighters too, that if they want to pick one buckle, that would be better than them screaming and yelling, especially if they have a major injury, from point A to point B to the hospital. So to allow them, and generally that will work if they can have the foresight to pick one of the belts, because there's 3 on a gurney. that generally will calm them down enough. Let's see. So this is really for law. Tricky conversation right now. With police, so I do a lot of training to help law officers really back up to creating more time. It's not what first responders are trained to do, but to create more patience when approaching someone that could seem different. And that gets tricky a bit when someone's running away from you and doesn't answer to their name. So a lot of the time people on the spectrum, even though they know their name, won't answer to their name. So you can see the discrepancies that would happen if they continue to move and an officer is asking them not to. So training for law officers is a big deal, and grateful that I have the opportunity to do it. So people with autism may feel more uncomfortable within a disaster and may want to remove themselves and run away. So generally, it's nice if there's the ability and there's enough CERT numbers that if you can create a zone where they can be, and even if they're running in circles and not running out into a street or to a different area, that you can allow that. And then I would even voice and say, we're going to keep you right here because we're trying to keep you safe. So Mark is standing there, Julie's standing there, and we're just going to make it so that you stay here. Can actually reduce the anxiety that's going on for everybody. I will say that I feel like people on the spectrum feel our heart rates and our energy more than any human that walks the earth. Seems extreme, but from being and playing and having the opportunity to be around so many people on the spectrum, one of my favorite stories about Jake is we were at the beach and we were playing ball, and there was someone probably 150 feet, maybe 200 feet in front of us, and all of a sudden Jake dropped the ball, ran up to him, said something, and then ran back. And I noticed the guy started crying. Sorry, walked up and just told Jake, I'll be right back. And I was like, are you okay? I'm so sorry. I don't know what my son said. And he said, your son knew my wife died yesterday. He told me that. I'm so sorry and you'll be okay. And I just started crying. We started crying. But it was like this different part where I realized Jake had different empathy. It might not be socially correct, but there's this tapping in that he has. And he still has it. Like if I'm even slightly frustrated with my husband, just slightly, which you know during COVID has happened a ton, he will walk by and he will stop and go, Mom, are you okay? What happened with Dad? And I'm like, oh, he's like, no, you're not okay. I'm like, okay, I'm feeling a little frustrated. He's like, that's right, that's frustration. Do you need any support? It's very sweet, but he just taps into that. So I feel like in a disaster situation, our folks that are on the spectrum are going to be really cued in to the extra heart anxiety, disastrous situation going on. So naming how people are feeling and calming ourselves by naming how we're feeling can really help people on the spectrum. Be combative, and even in that show, you may have to do certain circumstances that you're not used to doing. So doing that and knowing that there'll be an end result of trying to get to that point. We could go what ifs all day, but I feel like most people have the common sense. I do more what ifs with law enforcement because I feel like it's it is more black and white. Like it's either a lot of force or it's not. And I do think there's a lot in between, but for the common person, I feel like if we're designing with someone what we need to do and help that person, we're just going to do that thing. You can also say with the excessive stimming, I noticed you are doing that even more. So I'm thinking that you're feeling scared or lonely or fearful. And so you can kind of name what's going on. And remember when they're placing their hands over their head, that could be their way of shutting down. It could be their way of too much noise. It could be an indication to you of the surroundings that are going on that need to be addressed. see, there's a chat. So different type of empathy unique for your son or more common across the spectrum? It's a great question. I have seen it in other kids that I work with. I do think there are more. I don't know that they all can communicate it. So I do think that there is a special empathy. So I've worked with about 100 kids. I would say a fair majority have this kind of innate ability. I don't think they all can express it the way Jake does. Thanks for the question. Next one, assessing a patient. So removing as much excise stimuli that's going on. So when we're thinking of buildings dropping, fires happening, getting to a place where less chaos is happening to the best of your ability at that point in time. Locating someone who's familiar with the person just to give you input. Obviously, you don't have to have it if it's a disaster and things are crazy. More likely, people will be looking for them, right? There's more at stake with somebody that's on the spectrum than a kid that could go with anybody or a friend. And explain what you're doing at all times. So it kind of gets to that perseveration, to that knowing what's happening, that rigidity. So if you're explaining what's happening, not only are you telling them what to do, but you're actually going to be calming yourself in the meantime, which kind of gives that heart frequency that they can tap into as well. And giving constant support and reassurance. Now we deal with this in the psychology module, and we know not to say things like, you're going to be okay, everything's going to be fine. But what do you say? And you can name what's going on. Wow, this is a big disaster. And I just feel like, what is the next step we need to do? We need to stop and just take some breaths. And in taking some breaths, we're regulating and relaxing our bodies right now. How does that feel, right? So really being in that present moment, time. I saw another one come through. When I'm in an emergency situation which requires quick action, what is the best approach to take? So I think one that is instinctive, and if you know somebody's on the spectrum or they're different than you're used to, trying to give space. So your question, if it were an emergency situation that you needed to remove somebody quick because you were in the house with them or you were out somewhere with them and you know they're on the spectrum, you're going to do what you need to do. Like for Jake, I know the consequence. So it's neither here or there, which is going to be for anybody in that. But if you're then in a situation where it's 2 hours into the disaster, I would hope to give more time and space to the thinking, or have someone help you think outside the box to what would be the next step with this person so that you have support. So preventing meltdowns, we talked about the predictability, communication, avoid touching them, and allowing the stimming to happen. Allow the stimming and isming. So this is hard for parents when they're in programs like Applied Behavioral Analysis, ABA, because they're focusing on different skills. But in a disaster, that's not where our focus is. So this is for us. If you were to do this because it was a major disaster, really is about telling them what you're doing at all times, making it as safe as possible. This is about reducing noise. Hospital situations, I'm still working with ER rooms. Some ER places hospitals have quiet rooms now, which is great, and they have the different lights. Not all of them do. We're kind of blessed for like John Muir. Don't think Kaiser has yet. This is more law enforcement. So this picture is gone, socially vulnerable, but it has the, why am I losing the name? Urinals for men. And there's like a whole science to how men walk in and go to the bathroom and they don't go side by side. A conversation definitely to have if you have a boy. And I added this slide in because I went to a concert and saw somebody who was on the spectrum go into the bathroom, and when he came out, he was jumped in the bathroom and beaten up really bad. And I think getting the hold of the whole story and people drinking, right, was that he went next to somebody, right next to somebody, which I would think in a concert you would do, but because of that social inability to communicate properly, he commented on the person's situation, and from there it kind of unfolded terribly because he did not know how to communicate or tell the person what was going on. So be really aware when you're going out to places, and if you know somebody who has a child or a teen or an adult on the spectrum, making sure they're having this conversation. This slide too, I don't know why they're missing. The social curve, this is around same kind of scenarios, but around drugs, because you could tell somebody that's on the spectrum, hey, go give these drugs to X, Y, and Z, and I'll give you $20, and they probably would go do it, right? If they want to create some reciprocity or like just connection and they don't know what they're doing. So being aware of those things. So what can you ask? How do they take care of themselves is a big one. So that's talking back to when we were talking about the isming and the stemming. So are they rockers? Do they need to flick? Are they vocal? Do they, you know, are they self-soothing? Do they need to hold an object everywhere they went? So Jake held an object. He had a little car everywhere we went, and we bought 10 of that little car at one point because we knew we would need backup. So what do they have? And generally you'll find people of privilege do have access of those objects. What are the top 3 motivations? So they might want to talk about dinosaurs, cars, chase, a huge one that's really universal, I think, for typical and people on the spectrum. But to get from point A to point B, if you need in a disaster, I will chase you or I will win. You want to race. I have found is pretty global, which is amazing to have in a real need situation. And the seizure history, if any, and this is really amazing for our triage places too, because if they do have a seizure history and you know that someone just needs to ride that seizure out with them, then you don't need to go changing them from green to red to yellow. It might just need to be in their own section with somebody. Some seizures can be activated just by stress. So knowing that would be really useful. Things to remember, your energy and awareness makes a huge difference. And I know that can seem little. It's everything. Your awareness and just being able to name maybe how you're feeling in a moment is huge and can really create resonance with somebody that's on the spectrum. They have a correlation to the brain and receptivity, so they can understand better than they can speak. And you'll still meet parents who say they don't understand anything. Don't believe it. They feel like they know so much more than we give them credit for. And like seeing Jake, once he had language, how much he really knew and was in there, they really, really know. They do. I have a friend too who's doing this new program which allows them to speak through using an alphabet. And then I haven't done the training, but it's so cool. And these kids that haven't talked in high school are coming out with these full sentences of how they feel and how they relate to people and what they want to do with their lives. Like, it's amazing. So they really do understand the need for sign language and PECs and other devices to communicate. Social world is more challenging for them, obviously, all the nuances that we have, and sensory issues are pretty big for people on this spectrum with special abilities. I'll do that one. So focus on being calm and grounded. So whatever you need to do that you do in the disaster psychology to take care of yourself, make sure you're focusing on that when you're with someone who's on the spectrum. Connect with the caregiver, give constant support. And I say avoid using the word no. I feel like it's triggering for a typical family, but somebody on the spectrum, super triggering. Because they just don't understand why that can't be. Of course, young kids don't either, but they kind of like, they get used to parents going, okay, whatever, right? And move on to the next thing. But people on the spectrum don't understand why someone would say no. So instead of saying, don't do that, ask them to do something else. So I think around 8, we got better at this. I feel like it did take a long time, but he's getting into rocks and he's about to throw a rock at someone at the triage place that you're at. Hey, so that rock, can you come over here and paint it? Right, whatever it is that still allows that person to have what they have, but it isn't saying no, because you can guarantee somebody on the spectrum, when you're going to say no, is probably going to do that thing, even though that looks dismissive. It's just how they're wired, not that they want to be dismissive or not listening. This is Jake when he was little, when we got our dog. So that each child with autism is unique and may act differently than others you meet is so crucial, because one is not like the other, but there will be shared characteristics for sure. But just keeping an open mind that once you dial one in, there's the next. And I can do questions now. Thank you.
Not hearing you.
I'll stop this share so I can actually.
I need to unmute.
Oh, wait, you know what? Before I stop, I want you guys also, I will be giving Duncan these when I finish them. But there's something that will go in CERT kits. And can you guys see that now? They're little how to respond. And I'm working with a friend doing these. What is autism? Quick tips on medical situations, because obviously you have this training, but then to recall everything, it's nice to have just something in your bag that you can utilize. So there'll be tips for search and rescue, what to do, what you're looking for. And I'll also give Duncan and Julie the bags that we'll be giving to our fire departments for each of our ambulances. It's probably something great that we could put into our CERT kits, as well as these paperwork, so that we can use it all together.
Thank you all. Have a good night.